Good afternoon, everybody. This is a live emergency briefing as the threat of a severe weather outbreak is increasing Wednesday night through Thursday. Day 2 outlook retained as a slight risk, but it has been expanded to include portions of western Oklahoma, central Oklahoma, all the way down to the DFW Metroplex. That's going to be a Wednesday night threat. Looks like initiation of those supercells over western Oklahoma, possibly even the eastern Texas panhandle around late evening, 11 p.m. to midnight or so. Those will initiate and then move rapidly off to the east, bringing with it a late night tornado threat possibly across the Oklahoma City metro, probably embedded within a squall line that's going to be rapidly ejecting. But then the threat shifts to the day 3 time period, and the Storm Prediction Center has also expanded that slight risk, retained a slight risk, but I do think there is certainly a potential for an upgrade as the potential for strong to violent tornadoes seems to maximize over central northern Mississippi, eastern Arkansas, western Tennessee, and then spreading into central and northern Alabama, including that I-20 corridor during the day. There are some limitations for instability, but kinematics are so strong. The wind shear is absolutely through the roof that I think that the kinematic strength, the strength of those photographs, the very immense storm relative wind shear that's going to be available to these storms will certainly more than compensate. And I wanted to share with you this new photograph product. This is from the College of page. You can find it weather.cod.edu, and every single grid point on these models will display a photograph curve. It gives you an idea of how the low-level shear is evolving with time. This is the evolution Thursday or Wednesday night. So this is about midnight Wednesday, and you can see these photographs that are supportive of a tornado threat. Central Oklahoma down in northwestern Texas. They even get larger as that low-level jet begins to intensify, and you can head over to 850 millibars, and you can certainly see that these photographs will elongate as the low-level jet intensifies. The purple color, that's the low-level shear, basically below about 3 kilometers. I would say 2 kilometers and below is a low-level shear. And the more curved these photographs are, like what you see down into central Texas and all the way up into central Oklahoma, that is the most favorable, the strongest low-level shear for tornadoes. And notice how this low-level jet axis pushes off to the east as the surface-based instability catches up with that low-level jet. And boy, south central Oklahoma, down toward DFW, eastern Oklahoma, northeastern Texas by 9Z, which is about 2 in the morning, shows an environment very supportive of tornadoes. This is pretty strong low-level shear. And then by 12Z, you start to lose that surface heating a little bit during the diurnal heating minimum during the morning, the convective minimum as well. But now as we go toward late morning, about 15Z, you can start to see that surface-based instability begin to eject across western Arkansas. And then as the heating of the day develops across the mid-south, you start to see the development of that surface-based instability. Very favorable photographs here emerging across eastern Arkansas just ahead of that jet streak. There's a big jet streak around the southern periphery of this shortwave. That is going to be over northeastern Oklahoma, ejecting into Missouri by the midday Wednesday, and down into the warm sector, strong wind shear. But once these photographs right here, that intensifying low-level jet, meet up with that short wave ejecting over northern Mississippi, that's when that threat of strong tornadoes are going to be maximized. And look at all these curved photographs dominating the entire state of Mississippi, northeastern Arkansas. As you go further north, up tighter to the surface low, normally you'd think low-level shear would increase up nice and tight with the surface low, but you start to get more of these straight line type of hodos across southeastern Missouri and into southern Illinois. These are supportive of tornadoes, just not as favorable as further south across Mississippi, where you have those really elongated photographs, strong low-level shear, classic Dixie Alley photographs there across Mississippi. And this is at 21Z, so that's 3 p.m. Central Standard Time. Will likely already be several tornadoes deep by this time across northern Mississippi. And the short range convective allowing models are showing isolated supercells, renegade supercells moving into that environment. And then by about 0Z, 5, 6 p.m., that favorable environment for supercell storms begins to spread into western Alabama, into central Tennessee as well. Western Tennessee looks quite favorable. That's a very favorable hodograph located there near the Jackson area by about 6 p.m. Central Standard Time. By this time, the convective line and those renegades will be moving into Alabama. And notice how behind this prefrontal confluence line across the west of Mississippi, you get more straight line hodographs. You start to get a compression of those critical angles, and you get less curvature with the hodographs. So any storms that are able to develop along and to the east of that prefrontal confluence line will be able to move into this most favorable wind shear across eastern Mississippi and Alabama. And we can look at the 850 millibar wind speed, and it's not surprising that those strongly curved hodographs are coincident with the strongest part of that low-level jet, eastern Mississippi, moving into western Alabama by 0Z at about 6 p.m. By 21Z, which is about 3 p.m., though, that low-level jet anchored over central northern Mississippi up into western Tennessee as well. That's also where those most favorable hodographs are for tornado potential. Just before that, at about noon, though, it's over eastern Arkansas with 70-75 knot low-level jet. And that's also where the most favorable wind shear is located. You can look at the 0 to 1 kilometer storm relative helicity. Not surprising that the greatest wind shear is located right over eastern Arkansas, right near the core of that low-level jet. And then as you go toward 3 p.m., that wind shear ejects central northern Mississippi. Skinnier instability axis, though, to the north of that, across western Tennessee and up into southern Illinois. That's going to be more of a limiting factor up there, in addition to those more straight-line hodographs, helping to curtail that tornado potential a bit. But a squall line moving into that environment with each individual convective element moving a bit further right can certainly squeeze out a lot more storm relative helicity than might be indicated by those raw hodographs. And then look at that storm relative helicity, northeastern Mississippi, northern Alabama by 0Z at about 6 p.m. As I mentioned, the only limiting factor with this setup would be the instability. And I thought usually when you get these convective allowing models as you get closer to the event, usually the instability will ramp up when you get within range of that 3 kilometer NAM and the HRRR, and realizing that this jet streak is coming from northern Mexico over that higher terrain. There should be a dry slot or an elevated mix layer that moves over this new moisture. But it appears that because this is new moisture, rapidly arriving moisture from the Gulf of Mexico after it was recently cleared out by that Arctic blast, that usually equates to an abundance of cloud cover as well across the Mid-South. And I think that's why we're seeing a little bit less in the way of instability. You do have more as you get closer to eastern Arkansas, a little bit closer to that elevated mix layer. And the elevated mix layer just lagging a little bit behind. Just lagging a bit behind the instability axis here. And so that's at 21Z, and you go to 18Z, and that instability just starting to build into Arkansas. The NAM is indicating maybe some convection developing along that front, a little bit of a bulge surging into Little Rock. So there's a chance we might even be on tornadoes across eastern Arkansas and across the Delta. Very fast-moving storm system, however, as well. And there's that blob of surface-based instability that arrives into central Oklahoma at about 2 p.m., especially to the west of Dallas. A lot of convective inhibition is going to be in place across DFW, but then by the time that cold pocket of air arrives at about 12Z, so 4, 5, 6 in the morning, it does start to erode that cap, even down to the Dallas-Fort Worth area. But I do think that there is greater wind shear across south central Oklahoma for this setup tonight. You can see the greater wind shear off to the a little bit off to the east of the DFW area by the time that convective line arrives. But some decent wind shear in place, southeastern Oklahoma, North Texas. So as that convective line ejects, I do think that there is a decent chance of an isolated tornado or two in the overnight hours as that ejects. We could also look at the HRRR model for the convective evolution across the southern plains, as we are now within range of the HRRR. And let's see exactly where this model shows the initiation of storms. I hope you guys enjoy my new ticker as well that I have scrolling across the bottom. Pretty excited about that. New addition to my weather reports here. That's always exciting to have a ticker scrolling around the bottom. I also have the 500 millibar loop showing you that trough ejection, that very bulbous trough ejection as it exits the planes. We'll look at the 12ZH going up far enough. 4Z. Can start to see some evidence that that trough is beginning to eject, that cold pocket of air aloft. And as we step forward to about 11 p.m., finally you start to get an eruption of convection from the southeastern Texas panhandle across northwest Texas as well. Some of these could be supercell storms with a little bit more surface-based instability available to those, but look at the dew points into the upper 40s, back where those storms finally do initiate. You do have decent moisture advection, though, through the Dallas-Fort Worth area. By midnight, dew points should be pushing 60, 57, 58, possibly across central Oklahoma. And there's that convective blob that develops. Looks more elevated off to the north across western Oklahoma, bringing in some much-needed rainfall. But as this convective line pushes east and then gradually starts to encounter that deeper moisture, the near 60 dew points in place, there is a chance that some of these could become surface-based here near central Oklahoma at about 8Z. So that is about 2 a.m. or so, 1 a.m. Near the Oklahoma City area, once that convection is going to begin to arrive. It looks like the models are showing elevated convection getting strung out along this frontal boundary, and it does look like you're going to have these the echoes on the southern edge of that blob could be starting to dig into some of those deeper dew points. You definitely have near 60 dew points here advecting to the northwest of the DFW Metroplex. So right at about 9Z, at about 2 in the morning, the southern edge of that convective blob begins to arrive at the deeper moisture, upper 50s to near 60. And any of these storms that are able to maintain clean access to the inflow or the low-level jet will have a chance of producing a tornado or two, especially on the southern edge of that convective blob. We're able to get some surface-based supercells. You have a 50 to 60 knot low-level jet that evolves ahead of that system. Those certainly will have a tornado potential, especially this section of the convective blob into northwestern Texas. And look at these things line up. That's definitely a signature embedded supercells there just to the east of that 850 low. Big time low level jet as well, 50 to 60 knots pumping into that right on that gradient. There's your 850 low over southwestern Oklahoma. So that band of 3 to 4 supercells that sets up, even though it's embedded within that precipitation shield, could have clean access to this low level jet, that low level shear off to the southeast. And I do think there's going to be some tornadoes with that. About 4 or 5 in the morning, pushing east through the DFW Metroplex. Look at that low-level jet. Now finally being resolved by the HRRR. And I do think that this band of supercells far north Texas into southern Oklahoma definitely does have tornado potential as it pushes off to the east. Also watch this environment down near DFW. Once that convective inhibition begins to erode by this time, there is even a threat of a couple of renegades by about 5 to 6 in the morning near Dallas. But definitely what's going to save the day, probably in the DFW Metroplex, is that convective line is arriving during the convective minimum early morning hours on Thursday. But still, I do think there's going to be a few tornado warnings. Southern Oklahoma, possibly up near the Oklahoma City Metro, down to that Red River as well, down near Ardmore, to Lawton, up toward Oklahoma City, down toward Gainesville. That triangle appears likely. And then you start to get this convective band organizing over southeastern Oklahoma into northeastern Texas by about 12Z, and that's going to continue to push east. By this time, then, we'll be setting up into eastern Arkansas, probably northwestern Mississippi, near a river crossing, waiting for those storms to evolve and to move toward us at about 50 to 60 knots. I'm going to be teaming up with Captain Vanover again to try to capture our drone shot. There was a little bit of worry that should we chase both of these and chase the nocturnal setup across southern Oklahoma and north Texas and ride it all the way east. The problem with that is that you're setting yourself up to potentially botch up the Thursday storm chase, where I do think there's going to be even more substantial tornado potential. Eastern Arkansas, northeastern Louisiana, central northern Mississippi, western and central Tennessee, and also northern Alabama appears most likely for that convection. Looking at the composite reflectivity of the 3 kilometer NAM, there's your convective line pushing off to the east. This is at 6 a.m. Central Standard Time. Certainly an environment favorable for tornadoes out ahead of it, but you could see the abundance of cloud cover with the arrival of this new moisture even in just the precipitation coverage of the 3 kilometer NAM out ahead of this convective line. And because of that cloud cover, it is going to be a classic high wind shear, low instability type of a chase. Come on, give me the 500 millipart moisture, dude. You gotta be kidding me. I pay for the account on this. So there by 16Z as we're going into late morning, you kind of have a little bit of a downtick in the convection. And then as late morning begins to commence, close to midday, you've got this line that's marching through central Arkansas that could have tornado potential. And you also have the 3 kilometer NAM indicating these renegades forming along prefrontal confluence lines over the open warm sector in Mississippi, right in the core of that low-level jet as well across northern Mississippi. That would be a recipe for big problems right there if you get storms that develop within that environment at about 17Z. 65 over 64. Not quite enough surface-based instability out there for those storms to likely be surface-based initially, but they will gradually become surface-based as the afternoon goes on. My boy, you can see even the convective allowing models not lighting up the Cape across this area. That's the only limiting factor for this tornado setup. If this were later on in the spring, you'd probably be talking about an outbreak, a certain outbreak of tornadoes. But because of the slightly limited instability, hopefully that will hopefully be enough to curtail the tornado threat, but I don't think so. Usually when you get an instability axis that's pretty large like this, even though the Cape may be all 1,000 or below, when you have such strong 0 to 1 kilometer wind shear, that's why you get such an increase in the 0 to 1 kilometer EHI values despite those low surface-based Cape values, is because of the contribution of the low-level wind shear. There's your storm relative helicity by 21Z. You definitely want those prefrontal confluence lines. The actual front is back further to the west across eastern Arkansas, and then it looks like a prefrontal confluence line will set up near the Mississippi River. One out ahead of that as well, and ahead of that lead confluence line is where you get the strongest wind shear, eastern Mississippi into Alabama. The Birmingham area, Tuscaloosa area certainly is going to be big problems potentially with this if those renegade supercells are able to mature. It does look like they bubble throughout the day. Some renegades as well along the main front. But also the wind shear decreases as you get closer to the front. So you're going to want to watch these prefrontal confluence lines where the wind shear is a lot greater off to the east of them. I think as these mature across northwestern Alabama and as this prefrontal confluence line matures over central Mississippi, that's likely going to be the event. And look at all these renegades out there. Definitely an isolated storm mode. Deep moisture as well, even though it is new moisture contributing to some cloud cover. I still think that elevated mix layer, realizing that jet streak is emanating from the northern Mexican plateau. And you can see that the blob, a lot of the cold air aloft, shunts off to the north as the system shears out, instead of just barreling into the warm sector, increasing amplitude, maintaining a negative tilt that you will often see with more of a tandem trough ejection like December 10 and 11. That's another negative to this system, is that the cold pocket of air goes off to the northeast, leaving some relatively weaker lapse rates down across the mid-south. But anytime you get this massive low-level jet like this, you have to be concerned for the potential for strong to violent tornadoes, even long-track tornado potential all the way up into southern Illinois, southern Indiana, central western Kentucky, western Tennessee, northern Mississippi, northwestern Alabama. Shifting to central Tennessee, northern Alabama, central Kentucky as well with time. So you definitely do have to forecast the worst case scenarios for these, because if it is strong, long track, strong to violent tornadoes, then that's what you want to be prepared for. And these photographs are very favorable for strong to long track tornadoes. That's just a classic mid-south photograph. Your low-level jet about 60 knots out of the due southwest. Surface wind due south at about 18 knots, creating a ton of wind shear. You're looking down at the atmosphere when you're plotting this. So a southerly wind out of the due south at the surface. Your 2-kilometer wind southwest at about 60 knots. And then your 2, 3, 4, 5, 6-kilometer winds increase dramatically above that. A lot of moisture, though, with that new moisture, saturated low levels. Cloud cover definitely is going to be a negative for this setup. That's why the convective allowing models, as you're getting closer to the event, aren't ramping up that instability. Look at that elevated mix layer just above the ground. I could slide this off to the left and show you that sounding a bit. That dry pocket of air just above the ground, starting at about 3 kilometers, that is your elevated mix layer. So the green line is the dew point. And when there's a greater separation between the red line and the green line, that indicates dryness. And this dry pocket of air that comes in the mid-levels of the atmosphere is critical to severe weather setups. That's why you often see those tornadic supercells that are embedded within clear blue sky, low-level moisture, cloud sheets just racing south to north out ahead of it, supercell growing up into those steep lapse rates aloft. That's why you see that configuration so often, because you have to wait for the arrival of the mid-level dry air to come in from west to east to realize steep enough lapse rates to get those tornadoes. It's probably also important for other processes as well, but surprised that these lapse rates aren't steeper within the NAM model, given this dryness and this stout elevated mix layer that's going to be rotating in. And then your instability really begins to peter out by the evening hours. And then the threat shifts to flooding across the southern Appalachians. Flash flooding very possible across the western Carolinas, eastern Tennessee. Look at that. Already starting to get that signal in the 3-kilometer NAM for those asinine precipitation rates across the southern Appalachians. Same areas that were impacted by Tropical Depression Fred related flooding as well. Up into western North Carolina, that region, swath of snow off to the north with decent QPF. So in general, Thursday it looks like there is potential for strong to violent tornadoes given the magnitude of the wind shear. However, it is possible that by that system quickly shearing out and lifting off toward the southern Great Lakes, maybe mechanisms for lift won't be as substantial. Lapse rates possibly could be a bit lacking. And maybe your coverage of mature renegade supercells could be a little bit lacking compared to if that system is able to maintain its stronger amplitude upon ejection. But still, I do think there is the potential for a tornado outbreak, which is an event, a tornado event with greater than 6 tornadoes across a given region. I do think that is certainly possible with this event. And a lot of times, these high wind shear, relatively low CAPE events can certainly overperform. We've kind of been brainwashed into thinking that CAPE is this really important index. Back when I started storm chasing 25 years ago in Oklahoma, there were actually storm chasers that would not go out and chase unless the CAPE were higher than 3,000 joules per kilogram. And I'll tell you what, a majority of the tornadoes I've seen in my career happen in environments with much less than 3,000 joules per kilogram CAPE. So I'm definitely going to be chasing this event. That is for sure. And just to reiterate, I'll post the Storm Prediction Center outlook. A slight risk for Wednesday late night into Thursday morning. Includes Oklahoma City down to Dallas, but those storms will initiate across western Oklahoma and northwestern Texas. And then once they hit that moisture, that's when they're going to develop that tornado potential. And the day 3 outlook is still a slight risk, but I would not be surprised at all if we do see an enhanced risk, especially if the models show a reduction in that cloud cover, a little bit of an increase in the number of renegade supercells that are able to move into this environment. Either way, though, definitely agree with that large slight risk, including locations like Little Rock, Shreveport, all the way through central Mississippi as well, up toward Tupelo, the slight risk is west of Nashville, but I do think that convective line is going to move into central Tennessee with a tornado threat as well during the late evening hours of Thursday. So thank you everybody for tuning in to this weather report. I hope you enjoy my weather reports. Thank you, Facebook supporters, for making it possible for me to deliver these live briefings and live storm chase. We're going to continue to do those exclusive Q&As and forecast breakdowns like we did last night with the new models, introducing the new hodograph plot on the COD website. That's weather.cod.edu. It's a free website for models as well, which is awesome. So thank you, everybody. Have a great rest of your day. I'm going to hit the road tomorrow, and then I'll be live from the target area all day on Thursday, waiting for these storms to arrive. Never stop chasing.